All right, it's good to see everybody after Pesach. Last mimer was a little bit of a doozy, so I'm happy to be heading back into one that is a lot of fun. And I find I use this one on a regular basis, both for myself in terms of kind of realigning myself when I need personal spiritual realignment, as well as other people. I use some of the quotes in here. I mean, I would say almost every single time I'm talking to somebody and people say something like, "Oh, I'm a bad Jew," or something like that. I'm going to say 10 times out of 10, I'll bring some of the quotes in here from to them. And it never ceases to amaze me how people react. It's incredibly uplifting. So this mimer is going to have really two elements of it that I think are important to us. Number one is the general process of avodah. And we've been talking about the idea of avodah, serving God in general. And so the process itself, the movement from one place to the next, and he talks about these three stages, is one very, very important part of it. And then the other element is, how do we look at ourselves even every single day? How do we measure ourselves up? Whether that's a positive or negative thing to measure ourselves up, and how do we take that kind of assessment, self-assessment, into our service of Hashem? How do we use that or not use that? So as we're going to see, the Rebbe is really going to take an approach which is remarkable. It's kind of going to calibrate.
Rabbi, may I ask you a quick question?
Please.
I think you made an important comment when you said, well, somebody says, well, I'm a bad Jew. I mean, there's no such thing as a bad Jew. It's one that hasn't accepted whatever it is. It's not a value of being a bad Jew. And a lot of people feel that way. And then they become protected because, oh, I'm so far behind. So they need to understand that, as well as in the class, you don't characterize somebody as a bad Jew in that respect.
I brought that up is because, and the reason every single time somebody says I'm a bad Jew, I say, excuse me. First of all, I wasn't judging you. Second of all, even if I was, it would be inappropriate. Third of all, you're judging yourself in a way that's inappropriate.
Right, because the power is in with them.
That's correct.
And nobody else.
It's always that, what people, it's a funny thing because people have these pictures of dancing Chassidim on the wall.
Right.
They understand that's an ideal, but they say, okay, but that's not me. That was my grandfather. That was my great-grandfather. That was somebody in the past. And they don't realize that the truth of the matter is that inside themselves, there's very much dancing Chassidim, and they need to find that. And one of the reasons why they themselves badly is because of the fact that they're defining themselves based on an ideal that they know they can never live up to, or they feel that they can never live up to, and so therefore they'd say, "Oh, I'm bad." But that's simply not true on so many different levels. And this mimer is really very much going to give the antidote to that. I don't want to spill the beans right now. The first chapter is, as we've seen several times. Not every mimer does this, but sometimes the Rebbe will introduce an idea, introduce various concepts, and say, okay, we're going to understand this through the following discussion. So the first part of the mimer is very much, that's, if you don't understand that, it's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it at all. All the ideas that are discussed will be hopefully clarified by the end of the mimer. But we've spoken about this before, that oftentimes the question or the first chapter of the mimer is really just an entryway into a discussion. It's not critical. In Chassidus, we're not so much focused on trying to answer a specific question. We're more trying to elaborate and extrapolate ideas from those discussions. And so that's, again, just a reminder to everybody, don't get distracted by the following discussion. So, B'shashik dimu Yisrael nasal nishma. So everybody knows about Nasa and Nishma. Nasa and Nishma is that the Jewish people said, we will do and we will hear. And this is considered to be a critical moment in Jewish history. The Jewish people use the term we will do prior to we will hear. So we will talk a little bit about this concept, but the Medrash talks about it and says that, as we see in our opening quote here, when the Jewish people said we will do prior to saying we will listen, Nasa before Nishma, before receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, as a result of that, 600,000 ministering angels presented every Jew with 2 crowns, one for Nasa and one for Nishma. This is the famous quote, famous Medrash. So the Rebbe says that everything that heaven bestows on creation downwards is a direct reflection of and with the catalyst coming from creation upward. Everything's a system. This is an idea taken from, most famously, from the Maggid of Mezrich. He quoted the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Da ma lemala mimach," which means know that which is above you. And the Maggid of Mezrich explained that the words don't just mean know that which is above you, but he put in a comma. Da ma lemala mimcha. Know that what is above is from you. And there are several ways of understanding that. One of them is that the fact is that if you approach God in a particular way, God is going to respond to you in a certain way. If you approach God in a depressed, negative way, then the response to God is also going to be in a very constrained and lacking kind of manner. On the other hand, when you approach God in an expansive and in a joyous and in a way of openness and a relationship, then God responds likewise in kind. That's one way of looking at it. And here we're talking about something similar, that when we receive something from God, it's as a result of something that we did. So the fact that the Jewish people received the 2 quote unquote crowns as a result of Nasa and Nishma, we need to understand, as he says here, that it is therefore understood that there's a relationship between the idea of a crown and the Jewish people's verbal prioritization of action over quote unquote listening. Nasa before Nishma is a prioritization. So you have we will do, and we're going to explain later that the word Nishma does not just mean listening, it means understanding. And the concept is there was a recognition that the Jewish people had that we needed to do, and the understanding will come at a later process. On the other hand, if you try to understand everything in one shot, then you're never going to get around to doing, because you're just busy with trying to understand something. And of course, Judaism being infinite, there's no end to the process of trying to understand, and so therefore you never get around to doing it. So there are many important elements about that, and we'll discuss some of them later. But right now, we'll just keep that to the side. Let's see. So what we're saying here, of course, is that the fact that the Jewish people were presented with crowns is very much related to the fact that the Jewish people said Nasa before Nishma. They said we will do prior to we will listen. So we need to understand what that is. And we need to understand what's a crown and why is there a relationship. So the Rebbe says that the Hebrew word for crown in this text is keter. Now, of course, there are several different words that can be used for a crown. You could use the word ateret, for example, or there are other words that can be used. But here it's shnei ktarim, 2 keters. So the word keter has 2 meanings. First, it conveys something that surrounds and encompasses something else, like a literal crown, which circles a king's head. Why is a crown? A crown is because it's a surrounding, it's something that is around. And the Rebbe in the actual Mimer quotes two psukim that talk of kitruli, and several other psukim that are connotes not specifically a crown, but the idea of crowning, so to speak, which is encompassing something. Second, the word ketar also conveys silence. As Iyov says, ketar li ze'er, wait for me a little while. The waiting in the statement signifying an audible pause. So keter has also the concept of silence. Now, there are two different types of silence, as we're going to see. There's silence as a result of not knowing, a lack, an emptiness. And then there's silence that is a higher level of silence. And that's what we're going to talk about, the higher level of silence. And the Rebbe says both of these diverse interpretations can be aligned through the idea expressed in the Mishnaic aphorism. Silence is a fence for wisdom. So this is Siyag L'chachma Shetika. This is also from Pirkei Avot. And of course, in a very literal sense, it means if you keep your mouth shut, then that's a wonderful way of keeping yourself smart, or at least not revealing the lack of knowledge that you may have. There's a question, go ahead.
When you're saying the Rebbe had a high level of silence, he was talking about that. Did he mean enlightenment?
We're going to see in just a moment. We're going there in just a moment.
I couldn't hear you.
We're going to talk about the specific level of silence, the higher level of silence in just a moment.
But the word silence relates to enlightenment.
I don't think we're referring to enlightenment per se.
Okay. All right.
Okay, let's finish the paragraph and then we'll have a better idea of what it means. So, siyag l'chachma shtika, silence is a fence for wisdom. And so that's, of course, basically keep your mouth shut, and that way you'll be able to absorb wisdom. Keep your mouth shut, and that way people won't know what you don't know. And, all sorts of other ways of looking at that particular quote. But here we're going to take a much, much deeper approach to it. And I forgot to say, actually, today's learning is in the trust and belief and the complete refuah shlema of my sister Nechama Rivka Bas Fredo Sarah, who's having some tests done today. So it may go quick and easy, and all the issues be resolved very speedily and painlessly, God willing. So what is Siyag L'chachma Shtika? What's the deeper element of it? What's the Kabbalistic concept that's reflected in these words? So Rebbe says, just as a fence denotes a particular area by surrounding it, likewise, silence is the fence around wisdom. What does that mean? Wisdom, chachma, is the beginning of the process of intellectual revelation, and it is preceded by and fenced around by ket. So the stage prior to revelation is keter, and we've discussed keter several times before. That keter is made up of the more transcendent elements of the person. It's broken into two typically, and those two are tainug, which means pleasure, and ratzon, which is will. And we're not going to talk about those specifically here. But both of those elements are reflected by the concept of silence. Why? What this means is that an idea cannot be completely expressed within wisdom. Much of the idea remains unrevealed in a state of silence. And this is because speech is what is used to express an idea to someone else. The silence is therefore above speech. It remains in an encompassing manner beyond wisdom. So you have an idea, and you need to explain the idea to somebody else. The idea sitting in your head, and you need to focus in and give a very specific and driven concept. Now, as we drive that concept to somebody else, we need to silence out all the peripheral elements. So there are these peripheral elements that remain in our heads, but we don't focus on them, we silence them in order to be able to convey the idea. You have some people who are absolutely brilliant and they can't teach. And the reason why they can't teach is because of the fact that they struggle with this concept. They don't have the ability to be able to focus in and to silence out some of the ideas that are in their head. You'll hear them constantly flowing with more and more concepts. And you're like, hey, can you please talk straight? Well, they can't do it. It's not because they're stupid. In fact, they are oftentimes brilliant, but they don't know how to shut off the flow of ideas. They don't have the capability of silencing. So this kind of silencing is actually a higher level than wisdom. It's above wisdom. And in that area of silence is so much more than that which you have the capability of revealing. So Keter, the spiritual space of Keter, and silence are related to each other. Okay? And we're going to give one more corollary. And like I said, this first chapter is a little bit more difficult, but it's going to get easier very soon. And he says, creation itself also reflects on this concept. Actual creation occurs through the contraction and empty space caused by the apparent withdrawal of God's infinite light. This is something we've discussed before, the idea of tzimtzum, that God is infinite. He makes a decision to create. That decision itself creates what we refer to as Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. And in order to be able to create a limited and a viable, self-existing or apparently self-existing existence, it needs to go through the mechanism of tzimtzum, which is a contraction of the light, and which focuses in on one particular kav, one particular ray. It narrows down this one particular ray, and that one particular ray creates the world of Ishtalshelus. So that's the process of tzimtzum, this contraction of the entire infinity into one single ray that breaks through the quote-unquote empty space caused by the apparent withdrawal of God's infinite light. But prior to that stage is the general level of Keter over all of creation. And again, we're talking about Keter as it is in a broader manner, in a way of a total expansiveness, as opposed to, as we point out here, as opposed to an individual world's Keter. So, of course, there's a Keter of Atzilut, there's a Keter of Bria, and that is a Keter which is specifically focused on the capacity and abilities and style of that particular world. And the Keter that we're referring to over here is known in Kabbalah as the Great Ring, Igul HaGadol, the Great Circle, which does not reveal itself in creation. Well, this then is the mystical idea behind silence as a fence for wisdom. So, hang on a second before we go there. It does not reveal itself in creation, so therefore it's referred to as silence. And the Igul HaGadol is not something that's revealed in this world. It is beyond, it is transcendent, and so therefore is referred to as silence. So the Rebbe says that this then is the mystical idea behind silence as a fence for wisdom. Chachma is the beginning of Ishtalshelut, is the beginning of the chain of creation. Its fence, meaning the state that encompasses it, is silence, which is the great ring that precedes the singular line, the Igul HaGadol, which is prior to the Kav, prior to the one line which comes into creation and creates as a result of its vivifying energy, which is Keter. So we're seeing that Keter is a very, very, very transcendence. It's a very high level. And we're also seeing that the general concept of the giving of the Torah, as well as the preparatory stage to receiving the Torah by prioritizing action before understanding, is connected with the idea of Keter, as we will see. So we've given a kind of a broader look at what the idea of Keter is over here. And this entire subject, we're actually going to say, okay, we're going to put that on the side for right now and get into a discussion which seems to be a completely different discussion. And so the meat of this mimer is not going to be focused on this very mystical conversation that we just had. That's going to be kind of pulled back in once or twice in the mimer. And to be able to answer the original question, what's the connection with the Keter to the Jewish people saying Nasa before Nishma? But right now we're just referring to it as basically it's this ultimately transcendent level, which is the concept of silence. And we're going to pull that in a very relatable way very, very soon. So far, before we go any further, does anybody have any questions?
Rabbi, it's a beautiful concept.
Go ahead.
The higher level of silence. That's a beautiful concept. Beautiful.
Rabbi,
It has a lot of powerful reflections on it.
Rabbi, would you say
Go ahead.
would you say silence is synonymous with aloneness? Oh, lost your sound.
Good question, Avram.
If we are referring, well, alone, the reason why I'm struggling with it is because aloneness can have a negative connotation as well as a certain positive connotation. So the negative connotation, I want to say no, absolutely not. The positive connotation is that alone with God, so to speak, we're going to very, very much talk about that by the idea of where we're going to go into is that the silence is reflective of the concept of nullification as we connect ourselves to God in such a way that we are not interrupting the relationship, so to speak. So there is an element of
Is the rabbi frozen?
He's frozen.
Okay. Considering where I am with all the electronics, and I'm able to finally hear, and I'm on my own,
width, so to speak.
There he goes.
We lost you, Rabbi.
Robert, can he hear you?
No, I don't know.
No.
We lost the signal then, or he
Yeah.
dropped off.
I don't know. He's not. No, right now it's a big blank.
What just happened?
Oh, here he
I kicked
is.
out of my own
Okay.
class.
He's back. Or was.
Hi. I don't know what just
Okay. You're coming and going. You're coming and going, fading in and fading out.
I have full
Yeah.
signal here. That's very strange.
Yeah, you froze for a couple of minutes, for a couple of seconds before.
You're okay now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rabbi,
apologize.
Rabbi, if I may, one of the things my consideration is that it's not loneliness, but it's I'm trying to pronounce the word contemplativeness. It's retrospection. It's not that it's lonely, is that you're dealing with your relationship with Hashem and maybe other considerations. So you're contemplating is the word I'm trying to find. Contemplativeness.
So we're actually going to talk a little bit about that. And you'll see it's actually very interesting because we're going to supersede that. We're going to, so I don't want to spill the beans here because it'll ruin the fun. But we're going to talk that the silence is commensurate with self-nullification, and that we move ourselves out of the way of the. In other words, the more we get involved, there's always an element that we have to be involved in the relationship. There's no question about that. But there's a balance between our involvement in the relationship and our focus on God, the one that we want to have the relationship with. The more we focus on ourselves, as we're going to see, the less actual connection is created. And so that's a little bit of a teaser into where we're going to go here. But I would say that the loneness that is correct is that the ultimate purpose that we're going to talk about is this concept of nullification, what we refer to as bittul. It's something that we've discussed in several Maimarim until now, and it's an ongoing concept in Chassidic texts. The idea that we have to let go of ourselves in order to be able to transcend. And so that's going to be the broader idea that we're discussing, but we need to show that there's a process here. It's not just one of saying, okay, I'm nothing. And it reminds me of the classic joke just before we go. And I may have told this joke before, but the Yom Kippur, the rabbi is completely overwhelmed, and he falls down on his face and he says, God, in front of you, I am nothing. And then the chazan sees the rabbi falling on his face, and he falls on his face and says, God, in front of you, I am nothing. And the president is overwhelmed by the chazan and the rabbi, and he falls down on his face, God, in front of you, I am nothing. The chazan turns to the rabbi and says, look who thinks he's nothing.
Right.
So the idea of nullification and self-nullification needs to be defined. And that's what we're going to do here. And it's actually a process. And there are three elements that we're going to describe in the next chapter, which we will, God willing, we'll discuss on Friday. We're going to talk about the fact that the 3 months of Nisan, Iyar, and Sivan are reflective on these 3 stages of this process. 2 of them have to do with nullification. The third has to do with self, and how do we align all these pieces, and where do they bring us? And so that's where we're going to go. And it's a really, really fun mimer. I'm looking forward to exploring it with all of you. So with that,